hear me okay?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can. Well, thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed. So we have Alicia Diva, if I pronounce your name correctly, the author of Before War. The full title of it is Before War on Marriage, Hierarchy, and Our Matriarchal Origins, if I got that correctly.
Alicia Deva.
Dave, I'm sorry. Okay, great.
That's right.
Well, I read your book. I was fascinated. So, Kate here with another video. If you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. Helps me build the channel. So, I read this book and it was fascinating, utterly fascinating. You sent me a free copy, like a review copy over Facebook. I read the PDF. Really great. Now, so this is on the Buddhist debate, correctly? Correct? So I like to give a brief overview of it, of the debate, and you can, very brief, and you can correct me if I get something wrong, okay? So
Okay.
it's been known for a long time that most of the languages of Europe are related, like you get the Slavic languages, Russian, Polish, Czech, whatever, and they're related to the Baltic languages, Balto-Slavic. So then you get the Germanic languages, English, Dutch, German, Scandinavian, whatever, the Celtic languages, the Italic, Latin and Italic languages just died out. And then you have Armenian and Greek and a few others. So we've known for a long time they've been related. So British colonialists in India in the late 18th century picked up that they're related, European languages are related to the languages of northern India, like Hindi, Gujarati, Assamese, Bengali, whatever, and also to Iranian. So they're the Indo-European languages. Like we know that Lithuanian is actually closely related to Sanskrit. And I thought that was odd. Like there are gazillion thousands of cognates. Now, Lithuania had no connection with India, of course, but they were this most conservative of the Indo-European languages. So, anyway, there's the idea of an Aryan race, which is kind of a myth. It's so much more complicated than that. So a certain political group in Germany, and because of YouTube censorship, I'm not allowed to say it. They'll just say the Nazis in Germany had a horrible, horrible political philosophy. They had a version of this, highly distorted version of this. Anyway, after the Second World War, there was debate at least where the language family came from. The Proto-Indo-European has been reconstructed. There are YouTube videos where people speak Proto-Indo-European. It's been reconstructed, but at least it's the language half the world's population speaks an Indo-European language. So there's a debate at least where this came from. So there are two rival theories. One, Colin Renfrew, a British anthropologist, had an Anatolian theory that came up from Turkey. The ancestors, the Indo-European speakers came from what's now Turkey and came up and brought agriculture to Europe. The competing theory, which is so much more interesting, came from Maria Gimbutas, famous Lithuanian-American anthropologist. She had the Kurgan theory. The Kurgan, which I believe it's called Kurganists. So the Kurgans are burial mounds, which are around what's now southern Russia and Ukraine, which is in the news recently, but they're denoted a hierarchical, nomadic, semi-nomadic culture, mostly associated with Yamnaya, the Yamnaya archaeological culture, as far as I understand, as well as a few other, Makop, a few other places. Anyway, her theory was that the Indo-Europeans, Aryans, if you will, invaded Europe, came from there. They destroyed, essentially, what she called Old Europe, which was a matriarchal or matrifocal culture. Is that correct? And what was Old Europe all about?
Yeah, that was a good summary. According to her research, Old Europe was egalitarian, and actually some of the brand new studies that are coming out this week as we speak in part of the two main areas of Old Europe was the Danube civilization, and that's been getting a lot more attention recently. A book just came out about the Danube civilization. So the Danube is a river that goes through Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, and Serbia. And so a civilization known as Cucuteni Tripilia was in that area. So that was one of the major areas of Old Europe, as well as Anatolia, modern Turkey, a civilization called Çatalhöyük. And by the way, a lot of people sort of don't use the word civilization to apply to these Neolithic cultures because they define civilization as having to involve what they call social complexity, which is kind of an academic euphemism for oppression, class hierarchy, oppressive leadership, oppressive bureaucracies, which these cultures didn't seem to have. And there was a really shared level of, it seems like, cult religion around the earth goddess, and a lot of the same symbolisms. And even in the Danube area there in Eastern Europe, they had some form of writing which seemed to have been for a sacred purpose. It was associated with temples. So rather than the like later Sumerian empires and those oppressive empires, their writing seemed to have played more of a sacred role than a role in like counting tributes that your oppressive ruler would demand from you. And this culture did spread even into Central Europe, Germany, France, Spain. There's some old European cultures in Iberia and Spain, and then there was a somewhat similar culture all the way over in South Asia, India. Um, uh,
Indus Valley civilization. Yeah.
that's right, the Indus Valley Civilization, and they had a very well developed script, which unfortunately we're not able to read. So whether there was much contact between them, their goddess figurines were somewhat similar, and they had pretty large scale cities, very advanced architecture, which would decline after the Indo-European invasion. Even as big as like three story buildings, balconies. In Indus Valley, they had trash cans, running water. It was a pretty high standard of living. They didn't build monumental architecture like in later empires. Those sort of huge temples in Sumer and Mesopotamia seem to have been part of the sort of like oppressive atmosphere of creating temples for the status of rulers. So old Europe didn't have that, and all the houses were the same size. Plus, they had some sort of like larger temple buildings that seemed to have been, that weren't monumental, but that seemed to have been community buildings.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Interesting. So this culture was basically non-hierarchical, and she thought it was like matrifocal, not matriarchal so much, but matrifocal, more involved concerns with the role of women in society, more oriented towards that than later patriarchal cultures.
Yeah, according to the burial, looking at the burials, which is of course the aspect of their culture that we have most represented, women seem to have been, especially older women and young women, seem to have been buried with the most rich grave goods that seem to be symbolic in nature. So they probably played a huge role as priestesses, and yeah, it seemed that women were of primary importance. And
Okay, interesting. Now, this culture wasn't destroyed, your civilization wasn't fully destroyed right away. You described like three waves. One wave came and partially destroyed it, but they were the Indo-Europeans, whoever, were absorbed. But then several other waves basically totally destroyed it. Some of it was initially absorbed, but then destroyed it. Would that be true? That'd be correct?
yeah, and it seems as though modern research is confirming that, although she doesn't get a lot of credit for it still. But it does seem that in each successive Kurgan wave of invasion, as Maria called it, there was more and more destruction of the culture. So it would be like progressive levels of hybrids between Indo-European and old European cultures. So in the first hybrid, there was a lot more survival of the goddess culture. And with each successive one, it would be like new waves of even more sort of like patriarchal barbarians would come over the hill and then take over. It seemed that like in the first wave, the women that they conquered, because it was, of course, Indo-European men, only the men coming And whether they killed all the local men, the old European men, or whether they just prevented them from breeding, we don't know. But the genetic evidence is that the men were wiped from the genetic record. So,
Right.
um,
In the last like 6 or 7 years, ancient DNA sequencing has really advanced and basically confirmed Maria Buddhists. Like what they have what they call the corded ware archaeological culture, which are believed to be Indo-Europeans. They come out to be 75% Yamnaya and 25% Old Europe, and the 25% is from the mitochondrial DNA, which are from women. So it looks like they killed a lot of the men and enslaved the women. As horrible as it sounds, it seems to come out. Anyway, her theory, her Kurgan theory, has been vindicated. Even Colin Renfrew said, you mentioned, her theory has been brilliantly vindicated by DNA research. So that was interesting.
yeah, it does. I mean, we can't know for sure that the women were captives or
Yeah,
raped, but it seems
seems that way.
unlikely. It seems
Yeah.
unlikely that they would, want to, be with these men. And so all of us with European bloodlines are descended basically from Indo-European men and old European women. And it stands to reason that within a few generations, the old European women would have sort of civilized the men a little bit, and they got softer. I mean, because the hybrids were descended from both. And so then they would be easy prey for a next generation of Indo-Europeans to come over and create yet another level of hybrids.
Right, that's interesting. I was reading her this morning actually about the Basque people. Basque genetics has been sequenced, and they get most of their maternal DNA apparently from the indigenous people of Europe. Their male DNA comes from the steppe ancestry, from the Indo-Europeans. It's believed, and similar thing. Some Celtic people, the Celts of Ireland, genetically very similar to the Basque people, although different culture. Kind of a similar thing with some of the Irish people in Western Ireland. They apparently got a lot of their mitochondrial DNA from the indigenous people, and their Y DNA or whatever from the invaders. That's kind of interesting. Now, you talked about in your book how Buddhist theory came out in the 1960s. I think one of her first book was in 1960, if I remember. And it was kind of initially the mainstream, but then there was a really vicious counterattack, especially the debate on that was basically shut down. There was a conservative British anthropologist, Branislav Malinowski, if I got his name right, and there was this academic debate, but it was really shut down. Could you explain this?
Yeah. Ever since basically the dawn of the discipline of anthropology, which was in the time of Karl Marx, Marx and some of the other Marxists um, basically discovered, thanks to a couple of um, European settlers in North America, sort of independently discovered that a lot of North American peoples were matrilineal in the sense that they traced their lineage from mother to daughter instead of from father to son. And the women, even if men were playing leadership roles, the women chose them and could depose them, and the men listened to them, especially when it came to going to war. So the women had central roles in many of these North American cultures, although other ones are also patriarchal. But this was independently noticed, and then that really started this whole wave of scholarship amongst Marxists and early anthropologists, where the academic consensus was that for a long time, humans were basically, they called it matriarchal, which I kind of am reclaiming that, just not to mean that women suppressed or oppressed men, but that women were sort of at the center and highly important, or at least equal. And so that was kind of the consensus at the time, that early human kinship was matrilineal, and that there was a massive takeover of the human race by men, whether that was men acting alone or men and women both agreeing that men were going to be in charge. That was Engels called it like the takeover, the male takeover, and they understood that it was connected with private property, with property ownership, because once there's property ownership, of man wants to give it to his son, and in order to know who his son is, he needs to control women's sexuality so that paternity is known. So that was the assumption for a long time, until then in the 1920s, women got the vote, and in America, and that was highly triggering to this Malinowski guy, who felt really triggered by the women's movement, and he was a Christian, and he felt like the nuclear family and the male-headed family were sacred, and that it had to be the way, and he couldn't allow this talk of early matriarchies to stand, because inherent in the idea of the early matriarchies was that at one point sex was more free. There was a more open type of sexuality, because you didn't need to keep track of the father, and this was sort of anathema to him. And so he sort of single-handedly shut down this debate by getting the BBC to broadcast a debate between him and this guy, Robert Briffault, who wrote this like massive tome. It was like 3 books full of information about ancient matrilineal peoples from all over the world. And the two of them had this debate, and then after a while, I guess the people complained to the BBC that it was just too scary to imagine that that at one point women were in charge and sex was kind of free. So the debate was shut down, and somehow at that point, and this is how it happens in academia, it became taboo to talk about this early matrilineal kinship. And when that happened, anthropology ceased to make sense, because if you can't talk about matrilineal kinship, if you're hobbled in that way, then none of it makes sense.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. You mentioned the classic Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State by Friedrich Engels. It's not well known, but towards the end of his life, Marx became interested in non-Western cultures. He was influenced by his American anthropologist, Henry Morgan, who was adopted into the Iroquois nation, and he studied tribal traditional cultures around the world. And this was influenced Marx. And anyway, Origin of the Family, Friedrich Engels put this together from notes Marx left after he died. He got a few things wrong, but about 90% of it stood the test of time. It was written about 100 years ago, but most of it stood the test of time. But for various reasons, mainstream, like bourgeois anthropology, hasn't gone in that direction. There's like structuralism and functionalism. It just has some interesting insights, but they don't want to touch a material analysis of society. Friedrich Engels' book was a bombshell. It was like really threatening, like hierarchies are not natural. They're not rooted in nature. They're material reasons for them, things like that. And it mentioned, like an earlier matriarchal or matrifocal society, the vast majority of human society was egalitarian. We were hunter-gatherers. And there was no private property. There was no private property for anyone to hoard. It had to be egalitarian. There was sexual differentiation, but it wasn't a hierarchical society. Then hierarchy came in with property and patriarchy and things like that. Friedrich Engels mentioned what he called the world historic shift of the female sex, or I forget how he put it, something like that.
World historic takeover of the female sex.
Yeah, how he put it. Yeah, so this was really deeply threatening in some ways. So it's really interesting. And he did talk about it, ancient goddess religion, things like that. So it's really interesting. But this has been deeply threatening. The mainstream doesn't really want to talk about it. So anyway, this culture, old Europe, it survived like offshoots in Crete and a few other places. You talked about Crete. There's been a lot of debate around this, but the Minoan civilization of Crete was probably a later offshoot of the civilization.
Yeah, I mean the genetic data has really confirmed that what was obvious to Maria and others, that Minoan Crete was sort of the Crete and the Aegean Islands was where old Europe survived the longest into the Bronze Age, probably because the Europeans didn't want to hang out on those dry rocky islands, and except Crete was pretty lush, but you have a natural defense system from invaders when you're on islands. So the Minoans, were descendants of the Anatolian farmers, the old Europeans, and their kind of flowering of civilization into the Bronze Age was definitely the most advanced civilization we would see on the planet for the next, 2,000 years. Basically, they had flushing toilets and heated water and very beautiful architecture and. It seemed in the early days queens and extremely beautiful art, and that was a late sort of survival of old Europe, and as well smaller groups survived in the mountains. So the places where we find the most old European DNA today is in mountainous places where people probably fled to less desirable areas where the Indo-Europeans didn't find them, and so yeah.
Okay, interesting. And you connected this also with the Bronze Age collapse. Now, was it I forget when that was exactly, but like Eastern Mediterranean had like what's this is the 7th, 8th century BCE around that time had very advanced civilizations for the time, like Persia, Minoan, Mycenaeans, Egypt, very advanced. And in the space of about 40 years, just civilization literally collapsed. And we don't really know why. They're the sea peoples, various invaders. We don't know what was going on. You think this may have some connection with the fight with the patriarchal peoples and the more matrifocal peoples? Might have some
Yeah,
connection.
it was 1177 BC. According to this one book that came out a couple years ago called 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. So it was around that time. The Mediterranean civilizations, the Hittites in Anatolia. Egypt, had been around for so long that it didn't completely collapse, but it was weakened and it would never return to its former glory. It was then later taken over by the Greeks, basically, and became like a Greek and then a Roman province. And so, with collapses and historical events, I believe there's never just one thing. It's always like a combination of things. So there was the volcano, and that weakened the eruption of Thera, and that weakened the Minoans. There was climate change. There was a cold, a little ice age cold spell. So there was a lot of things. But usually, what's given as the main reason for the collapse is attacks of these people that were called the Sea Peoples, and for a long time it was just this mystery, like, oh, who are these people? But now, again, genetics have determined that they were the descendants of the old Europeans. So Philistines is one of the groups, which the word is probably related to Pelasgians, and Pelasgians is the name that Indo-European Greeks gave to the indigenous people of Greece that they invaded.
Right.
And the Philistines were in Middle East,
Right.
so basically the indigenous people of Middle East. And Middle East was, what we call now Middle East, was part of old Europe, very similar culture, the Halaf culture in Syria. So like that was part of old Europe, and these were sort of descendants of those people. And so somehow they attacked everybody and brought these empires down. And according to one book that I have in my bibliography called The War of the Gods, he traces how so many of these battles that were fought, that have come down to us historically, were battles over matrilineal versus patrilineal succession for rulers.
Oh,
So it was
right.
traditional for in the Hittites, both the Hittites and in some Middle Eastern cultures, for men to become rulers by marrying a princess. So, and in Egypt as well. So in Egypt, there was matrilineal succession for these rulers, and then men started saying, "No, I want to pass my crown on to my son and not my nephew," and that was so taboo and so angering to this long standing tradition of matrilineal succession that that wars were fought over it. So, and it seems as though 90% of people in these empires were killed in these battles. And then there was a 300-year Dark Age period in which there was no writing, no art. It was in Greece anyway. So it does seem it seems likely to, now that we know who the Sea Peoples are, to believe that this war of the sexes had a huge role in destroying these empires.
Interesting. Now, you talked about the Indo-Europeans, Yamnaya, or wherever they came from. why they seem to opt out of the more matrifocal culture. They uniquely opted out of it. Maybe some Semitic peoples did as well, but not all Indo-Europeans were like this. And you mentioned the possibility of some traumatic event, maybe connected to climate change, which kind of made them this way or warped some of them. The Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-Europeans, they were the more ruthlessly patriarchal, while other groups weren't quite the same way. What would you think was connected to climate change, or what happened?
That's the thesis of a very large book called Saharasia by James DeMeo,
Okay,
and it's it's like this thick, and there's all kind of charts and pictures, and it's very convincing that he traces all of these traits that are connected with patriarchy, circumcision, both male and female circumcision, um, female seclusion, making the women be trapped in the home so that they won't lose their virginity before they're, sold off to the man they're going to marry. All these kind of traits, he shows on a map how they're most intensely in the areas that he calls Saharasia, which is basically the area from North Africa through the Middle East into Central Asia, which apparently desertified very quickly, maybe even as quickly as within 100 years, went from a fertile place to a desert. And he believes that was the time that created this intense trauma and this scarcity of resources, which then led to the development of pastoral lifestyles of herds, and that these herds, as opposed to farming, so in farming communities, women had a lot of status because they were the ones that developed farming as it developed from foraging, from gathering. But in pastoral communities, I guess there's a tendency to do cattle raiding because the person who controls the cattle controls all the resources, and it's very impossible to hoard it. And so then once you hoard a bunch of cattle, you want to pass it on to your sons, and you create this kind of like chieftain culture.
right, but
But
not
maybe
all.
some
Right. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
maybe some Indo-Europeans weren't like in as close contact. So it's not that there's a ethnic reason why Indo-Europeans are just bad. It seems like some of the like uh, Baltic people and even Germanic people stayed pretty egalitarian well into the Iron Age. So if they
Okay.
were further from Saharasia, maybe they didn't get this virus as much. Or if they had a very large substrate of old European matrilineal people that kind of kept them egalitarian.
Right, like as I understand in linguistics, the Germanic languages are
Mm.
kind of different from other Indo-European languages. They're believed to have some sort of substrate. We don't know for sure. Oh yeah, Greek. Apparently, 50% of Greek is non-Indo-European. It's considered
75%, according to some.
75. Whoa, okay, that's interesting. So there's a definite, very large substrate they're imposed on. And you said it was kind of connected to, I can't pronounce it, agglutinative languages. Often tends to be kind of matriarchal.
Well, as far as I can tell, all languages, aside from Indo-European or Semitic languages, are agglutinative, more or
Oh,
less. I mean, nowadays they're all mixed up, partly because of these colonization events. But before the colonization events 5,000 years ago, it probably would have been much more distinct. So agglutinative is the opposite of inflected, to sort of oversimplify. It's not terribly simple, but inflected is the languages we're familiar with, like French and Spanish, where you add a little suffix onto the end of a word to indicate, like when you conjugate the verb, like we go, you go, they go. In English, it's gotten really dumbed down, but in most Indo-European languages, they use little pieces of words to indicate who's doing the action. And that also goes for nouns as well, which English has completely lost. But agglutinative languages add bits of words on in a different way to indicate meaning. So, like one agglutinative thing in English is hopelessness. Like the less indicates none, and the ness indicates the noun form of. And so agglutinative languages tend to have like a very sing-songy, rhythmic effect. Dida, Indonesian Bahasa, where it's like a lot of repetition. And so inflected languages kind of came out of nowhere. Supposedly Indo-European and Semitic languages aren't connected or don't have a parent language, but it's very strange how both of them became inflected very suddenly at the same time. And it's very strange to me how both Semitic and Indo-European groups were the two patriarchal groups, and they also were the only ones to have these inflections and some of the only ones to have gendered language. So in English, the only thing that is left that's gendered are the pronouns him, her. But in English and Spanish and French,
Yeah.
still there all of the every
Okay.
noun is a masculine or feminine.
Right.
So that was a patriarchal
Uh,
thing that suddenly became really important to divide the world into male and female.
Interesting. Would you see something similar happening in other, like China? It's traditionally been very patriarchal, but there's some evidence way, way back there might have been early matriarchal culture, very ancient cultures. So similar things in China and East Asia and other parts of the world.
Yeah, I don't know as much about China, partly because it's been behind the communist curtain for a while, and so we don't receive a lot. If they're doing archaeology, we're not receiving a lot of it. But
Uh,
the so far, the most we know is that a lot of the matrilineal cultures who survived into at least the mythological period to be spoken of in myths were on the Tibetan side. So
uh,
Tibetan type people, they were called the land of women, and they survived into the modern era as like the most woe people.
uh,
In China, are have maintained their matrilineal ways.
right.
But I do trace some evidence that there was some early contact with Indo-Europeans. There's a lot of similar words that came across from Indo-European, and that might have been the reason that China became patriarchal was due to that contact.
Right, interesting. In China, there's a Yunnan province in southwestern China. There's the Naiji people who are matriarchal, small. They have a couple of cities, small cities. Dali. It's like on the backpacking trail. I've been there. It's pretty wild. Kind of
Hmm.
remote area, but really fun. And also, the ancient cultures of Yunnan province were matriarchal. There's a Yue kingdom, which was matriarchal, and there's some big remnants of in southwestern China to this day. That's kind of interesting. Maria Gombudas, her theories became popular and somewhat pop influential in the 90s. There was like a bunch of books. There was almost like a pop culture version of her. And there's a book, The Chalice and the Blade by Rian Eisler, Austrian writer, which was really interesting and popularized a lot of her ideas. But then there was a counterattack, a big counterattack. She was being associated with what's called the goddess movement, like some pagans, Wiccans, and some currents of feminism. And this gave her like people thought, oh, it's crystal woo and mysticism, and so people got turned off. That this was used against her. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, you know, academia doesn't mix very well with spirituality, and so this whole idea that God used to be a woman was such a relief, I think, to a lot of women who were so tired of just hearing about God the Lord and these patriarchal religions where there doesn't really seem to be a place you know for the feminine. And so it was a big deal, this idea that of the goddess, and so that kind of sparked this neo-pagan goddess movement, and which I remember in the 90s was great. Like I remember that as being a really good time. And then, but so back to the European debate that you summarized, her rival, the one who believed that Indo-Europeans came from Turkey, wasn't happy with the success of her Kurgan theories, and he shut her down basically. And he had a lot more power than her. She was just a Lithuanian, so from the backwaters of Europe. He was a lord, and
Oh, Renfrew, yeah, he was a hereditary aristocrat. Lord Renfrew, yeah.
Lord Colin, yeah. And so he had an enormous amount of influence in the archaeological establishment. And so he was able to just kind of make some insults, some well-placed insults here and there. Suddenly people started making sort of misogynistic insults about how, oh, she's obsessed with fertility goddesses because she's going through menopause. And suddenly it became, as it does in academia, kind of trendy to distance oneself from Maria, to make little insults. And, so for even for female archaeologists, like a woman named Cynthia Eller, who wrote a book kind of trashing the goddess movement. And it doesn't, and in academia, when these kind of movements happen, it has nothing to do with truth. Um, but everything to do with just, I mean, just like in high school, when someone can say, make some stupid insult, and then if that person is popular, then it doesn't even matter what is said. So no one has ever been able to argue with her theories. Her theories have been vindicated by genetics. There's some hand waving now. Nowadays, to this day, people still distance themselves from her. It's still trendy to kind of like be so objective by saying, oh, there's no proof that these figurines were actually goddesses. Well, these figurines go back, hundreds of thousands of years. These Venus, so-called Venus figurines with the, large buttocks and breasts, these very exaggerated female characteristics. And there is, in fact, proof that they were goddesses, because the ones from Neolithic times in prehistory look exactly the same as later attested, historically attested goddesses like Cybele from Anatolia. Looks exactly like Çatalhöyük goddess seated on a throne with lions flanking her. We know later from history that she was a goddess. So nothing even about her migrations. Maybe some people will argue with very minor points of the dating of a migration, but nothing has ever been disproven. But a few well-placed insults, and all of a sudden her career was ruined. She couldn't get funding.
Right, right. Yeah. She was a research anthropologist at Harvard for a time, but they treated her really horribly because of sexism. At one point, they gave her an office right next to the women's bathroom, like yucky stuff like that. She moved to California. I think in your book, she seemed to be happy in California, but they really slammed her. They really viciously attacked her. That was too bad. Some people claim like the statuettes were prehistoric pornography and they weren't really goddesses and things like that. Have you read the Wikipedia entry on it? It smears her. It's really hard. Wikipedia is horrible for any like contemporary thought. It's okay for looking up the name of a dinosaur or
Exactly.
but any modern Wikipedia is just really horrible. They smear anybody outside of the mainstream. Really, yeah. It's interesting. Question I would have. From a Marxist perspective, many Marxists would feel that you need it was kind of ambiguous, but you need like the abundance created ironically by capitalism. Like capitalism is horrible and horrific, but it is unleashed a lot of human power, like above feudalism, like enormous productivity. It is horrible, but it's unleashed enormous productivity. So like there were zillions of peasant uprisings in Europe. Late Middle Ages, the Fraticelli, offshoots of the Franciscans, and then there were the left wing of the Protestant Reformation, the Hutterites. There was actually a communist group in Munster, like this is the 1600s, 250 years before the French Revolution. And there were uprisings, the Mazdaks in Iran, and there were peasant uprisings in China. Sometimes they succeeded. But if these uprisings succeeded, they usually just became another ruling class. So the idea was that the means of production weren't advanced enough. You need the successors of capitalism, ironically, to create an egalitarian society. So I'm far from an expert in any of this. Marx himself might have been up in the air. Like he corresponded with some Russian fellows, like this 1880s. There's some thought the Mir, the Russian peasant commune, could have provided a foundation for a type of socialism, like before the Russian Revolution. Russia wouldn't have had to go through the capitalist stage. So is it possible to create an egalitarian society before the Industrial Revolution? I don't know myself. Marx might have thought so, and I'm far from an expert on this. I mean, I'm really, really fascinated by this. What you say is very appealing, but some Marxists would push back. So you can't. Not that people are basically bad. but you need the abundance created by like modern technology. What would you say to that?
I think that nobody knows,
Okay.
it's like, how do we, I mean, I believe it's worth trying to recreate an egalitarian society, but that it needs to be done not through force, because that tends to be contrary to human nature, and that resource abundance does seem to be a critical part of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there were probably were somewhat egalitarian societies before the modern era. They didn't, maybe they were destroyed, but what you're saying points to like why it's so fascinating, an alternate direction human civilization could have gone in. We went in the wrong direction, like an alternate history, alternate direction. We could have healthier direction we could have gone in, and that was cut short. Would that be accurate?
I'd say so. I mean, probably the most fascinating recent resource for that kind of research is The Dawn of Everything by
Okay,
David
yeah,
Graeber and
you
David
mentioned that.
Boyle. And they go into some more recent South American, Central American cultures that seem to have been egalitarian, and even some research that points to the idea that, like, even some cultures that became patriarchal then seem to have switched gears and gone back to egalitarian. So
Oh,
there, it does seem to be possible to go in that direction.
okay.
Um, yeah, and I think the first step is just knowing that that's possible for us, instead of assuming that that at a certain level of complexity, oppression hierarchies are inevitable.
Right, so there could have been alternatives to the way humanity developed, essentially, and there still are. Not that Indo-Europeans are inherently bad, but just their material conditions drove most of them in this direction. That's really interesting. There was this group, the Tocharians, like Indo-European speaking people lived in Western China. There's still a lot we don't know about them. They may have been matriarchal at one time to some extent. The Uyghurs today are probably partly descended from them, but
Mm,
it's kind of interesting. They're Turkic-speaking people, but they probably intermarried. I've been to Xinjiang. I've been to Western China. The people some look East Asian, some look Western European. They're like
mm.
Uyghurs who are blonde and look European. So I mean, they probably have this Indo-European element in them, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, you said you're also currently working on another book on about early migrations to North America. Is it?
Yeah, I feel like this is a really important part of the thesis, because I mean, basically the thesis of before war, or really the question, the open question is, did patriarchy just arise once amongst the ancestors of the Semites and Indo-Europeans, and spread from there, or is it a natural kind of situation in the universe that arises naturally in response, especially to drying conditions or limited resources, or did all the instances of patriarchy we see, are they a result of contact with either Semites or Indo-Europeans, or someone who was contacted by them?
Mhm.
And most of the groups that I look at have obvious signs of contact, mostly with Indo-Europeans if we're talking about Europe, and mostly with Semites if we're talking about Middle East and Western Eurasia.
Mhm.
Except for Australians, the patriarchal, more patrilineal Australian groups, and Papua New Guineans. So those are two sort of mystery populations. There may have been contact, there may have been not, but it seems as though the Tocharians, their language split off from Proto-Indo-European before many of these linguistic changes that change to inflected language. Like, they still have really ancient Proto-Indo-European features, and it seems as though that like there's no archaeological evidence for status hierarchies and violence. So they may have been a really early Proto-Indo-European group that branched off before the patriarchal event.
Right, that's interesting because, as I understand, we reconstructed their language. That they were Buddhists, and they're like Buddhist sutras in the script used in India, but in their own language. and there's like a northern dialect and a southern dialect. I've had a geeky interest in this kind of stuff. So northern dialect, southern dialect, and it's Indo-European, but it's not Indo-Iranian. Like it's not related to Iranian or Indian languages. So it must be like a different, maybe much earlier branch of Indo-European languages, not related to the main and early split from it. Well, we don't know, but it is really fascinating. So there must be a separate stream, not Indo-Iranian Indo-Europeans, if that makes sense. That is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And we briefly talked about Graham Hancock. He's kind of a alternate theory. I think there's an ancient civilization, advanced civilization, like 100,000 years ago, if I'm correctly. My knowledge of him comes from watching Joe
Actually, he
Rogan
said
early.
more like 11,000 years.
11, okay, 11. And he thinks it might be in North America, as I understand. But he thinks there isn't a lot of evidence for it. He's very kind. He's not in the mainstream, but he is. We're thinking about it. You think he may have something to it?
So now we get back and finish my thought about
Okay.
America. So one of the biggest sort of reasons why people give for them to believe that patriarchy and hierarchy and inequality are inherently natural and inevitable is the development of these hierarchies in the Americas. And so that's why I want to write this follow-up book, which basically shows that patriarchy may have come from pre-Columbian migrations or journeys there. And the
Okay.
evidence is overwhelming for
I
that.
think so. Okay. Interesting. There's the Solitrean hypothesis, as far as I understand. There's a Solitrean culture in Europe, but some theory kicking around, some Europoid people were in North America before Native Americans or something.
Yes, that there were migrations as early as 20,000 years ago.
Okay.
The Solutrean, sort of like early Homo sapiens, yeah.
So,
And there's genetic evidence for that as well, but also for many other migrations. Chinese,
uh
there's a lot of evidence that the
okay.
Chinese were in Mexico, and that could have attributed for caused the patriarchy in the Oaxaca area. Evidence for Minoan migrations. A lot of Minoan inscriptions have been found, and then as well African and Hebrew, Egyptian. So yeah, I feel like that's really important. And so as far as like Atlantis like I don't really get into the Atlantis stuff as much because, what I'm talking about is controversial enough without bringing that into it. But I guess he believes that it was like a global culture, that was a global seafaring culture, and perhaps that America, was part of it.
Okay. Interesting stuff. So, with all this, what do you see as the way ahead, future for humanity, or can we recover that matriarchal or matrifocal culture you discussed? What's the best strategy ahead?
Um, in my final chapter, I give my sort of ideas on that, but I think the first thing, and my reason for wanting to write this book was that just the first thing is just to accept that it's possible, that it isn't inevitable, that we're total assholes and dropping bombs. And then on a personal level, I think for each one of us to try to like have awareness of how we oppress others. So like, whatever are my sort of power situations in my life, the people I have power over, how do I treat those people? How do I treat, the wait staff or the teller? Like just being aware of our own oppressive tendencies. And then on a family level, really trying to sort of inherit the family money towards, the mother, the daughter, if she's becoming a mother, or the son, if he's the only one having children, but really trying to get out of this nuclear family, as instead focusing on creating a stable environment for children, ideally like with one's kin family or chosen family, getting away from this
Nuclear family.
childhood idea, the fatherhood being linked to monogamy, because that does seem to be a really big part of it. Of course, you can choose monogamy and fatherhood and all of that, but really trying to get out of like having the contract more be as co-parents rather than having a contracted type of sexuality around monogamy, I
Right.
think.
Interesting. Yeah, okay. Yeah,
Choosing
sorry.
that for the
Yeah,
right reasons
right,
rather
right,
than just doing it in a knee-jerk way. And then on a more society level, I really think that communities, intentional communities, are the way to go. So creating um, extended communities to raise children in, cooperating, so to get out of the rat race capitalist system that creates this whole sort of rat race situation. And then, electing more women, not where they're not qualified, not over, more qualified men, but just having the understanding that the more women there are in a political situation or in a corporation, the more tendency there is for cooperation over competition. And that's not because women are better, but because women have been conditioned that way. And so the women who tend to become leaders in our society now tend to be the most patriarchal, the most um,
right, right.
competitive one. But I think the more that we try to choose people who are wanting to lead from a place of responsibility rather than from power over, the better.
Right, right. Like you get like the CEO of Yahoo is a woman. The first thing she did was end a maternity leave and
Oh,
then require people to work who didn't allow her working at home anymore. The very first thing she did when she got in. So, yeah, interesting. So I can't think of anything else. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Uh,
um, No, I really hope this gets out there somehow. My dream in life would be to debate Jordan Peterson because he likes to say that hierarchies are
yeah,
inevitable. Being
lobsters,
lobsters,
lobsters.
yeah, lobsters. But there are, I taught one chapter of the book is about primates, and so I go
Mhm.
deeply into the primate models that
Right.
there are some more hierarchical
Bonobos,
primates.
bonobos, yeah, yeah,
Bonobos,
bonobo,
which
yeah,
are,
yeah.
it's in bonobos, the female cooperation is what minimizes male violence. So there's far less male violence because the females are forming a coalition to prevent that, and that's kind of the direction we need to be going. That being said, there are lots of male allies out there. Some of my biggest fans are men because they understand that in a situation that's more balanced between male and female, there's less violence, there's less war, and so it's better for men too. And they also understand that patriarchy, far from being the conversation about blaming men, is really affecting men too, almost as much. And now we're starting to see serious losses for men in terms of academia, in terms of the job market. Men are really dropping out. They're committing suicide.
Right.
And I believe that this is because patriarchy has really deprived men the the encouragement to create, deep bonds with people, to get support where they need it. They're kind of like made to do the dirty work and keep quiet and be stoic, and that's done an enormous amount of harm to men. So I guess I just want to finish by saying it's not about men versus women. It's about men and women joining together against an institution which at this point is really just a habit that the more we understand about it, the more we can just kind of like heal from it. And healing from trauma, I believe, is a really huge part of it.
Right, interesting. Yeah, yeah, I just want to mention you mentioned Chris Knight, reference the British anthropologist Chris Knight. I read the book Blood Right by him. It's
Hmm.
really amazing. He was a British Marxist. He was pushed out of academia because of his politics. But book Blood Right basically it basically says that most of human history, 300,000 years, large part of it, nothing happened. Like there was some cave art and stuff, but stone tools, nothing to write home about. But all of a sudden, like 100,000 years ago, there was a cultural explosion. And people woke up, and he thinks it was because of a shift in gender relations. Like he was almost like, kind of like the bonobos. Like is essentially a sex strike. The way I put it sounds crude, but he builds his case really well. There's like Bonhoeffer's women, like there's a Greek play, Aristophanes' Lysistrata, where the women refuse to sleep with the men because they're going off to war all the time. He thinks something like this happened in like East Africa, like 100,000 years ago, or a couple 100,000 years ago, when this forced a shift in cultural relations and social relations, early Homo sapiens, and this is what gave rise to human culture. Like women drove human culture. Fascinating book. It's really the PDF. You can get the PDF. It's online, a couple different places. It's really fascinating. It's a thick book, but he builds his case really well. He describes indigenous people, Australia, and around the world. Builds his case pretty well. He talks about Engel's book, Origin of the Family. Really intriguing book. But anyway, to end here, where can people find your book? Find your book on war. Where can people find it?
Before War, it's on Amazon. And the ebook is, and the black and white version is on Amazon, and the slightly more expensive color pictures is on bookshop.org, independent bookseller.
Okay, great. Well, I can't think of anything else, and I want to thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Okay, have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.